My beloved child. There is a moment unfolding that you cannot see, yet it is quietly reshaping two hearts at once. Somewhere beyond your awareness, someone you have never fully stopped being connected to is struggling to steady their breathing because tears keep finding their way down their face. They are not tears of heartbreak. They are tears that arrive when hope returns after being buried beneath months of silence. And the reason those tears exist has everything to do with something you finally did, something that felt so ordinary to you that you almost dismissed it before the day was over. You believed no one noticed the invisible battle you fought. You smiled when it was easier to disappear. You chose patience when frustration begged you to react. You whispered a prayer no one else heard. You released one painful memory instead of carrying it into another sunrise. None of those choices earned applause. The world kept moving as though nothing had changed. But there are moments that never make headlines in human eyes while echoing through unseen places. This was one of them. And somewhere, without understanding why their hearts suddenly felt lighter, another soul stopped what they were doing and pressed a trembling hand against their chest, wondering why peace had arrived without warning. Imagine them for a moment. The room around them is quiet except for the faint sound of rain brushing against a window. A cup of tea has long since grown cold beside them. Their thoughts have been tangled for weeks, maybe longer. They have questioned timing. They have questioned themselves. More than once they wondered whether they had imagined the strange pull that kept leading their heart back towards someone they could not explain. Every attempt to move forward somehow circled back to the same feeling, the same invisible thread that refused to break. Tonight, something changed. Not because someone called. Not because a message appeared. Not because dramatic words were spoken. The change began with a gentle warmth spreading through a place inside them they thought had gone silent forever. They closed their eyes, and without understanding why, a memory surfaced. It was not a perfect memory. It was small. The sound of laughter they had almost forgotten. A look exchanged in an ordinary moment. A feeling that life had quietly placed two unfinished stories on paths meant to cross again someday. They tried to push it away, but the memory only became brighter. Then came the tears. Not the kind born from loss, but the kind that arrive when a weary heart suddenly remembers what hope feels like. Still, one question refused to leave them. What happened today that made everything feel different? While they searched for answers, you continued living your day without realizing the weight of your own decisions. You chose kindness where bitterness could have spoken. You stopped carrying guilt that was never yours to begin with. You forgave someone in your heart without announcing it to the world. Perhaps you simply decided that your future deserved more attention than your past. Whatever it was, the choice created a quiet ripple that traveled farther than you could ever measure. Some changes begin with fireworks. Others begin with one soul deciding they no longer want pain to write the next chapter. Yet this story reaches even deeper than that. There were moments when your soulmate nearly convinced themselves to stop believing altogether. Friends offered practical advice. Logic suggested they move on. Time whispered that waiting was foolish. They listened for a while. They smiled politely. They pretended they had accepted a different future. But every attempt to silence what they carried inside only made the truth louder. Their heart refused to cooperate with fear. It kept insisting that something unfinished still existed between two lives separated by circumstances neither fully understood. Tonight, as they wiped tears from their face, they whispered words no one else was meant to hear. If this feeling is real, then show me one more sign. The room remained still. The rain softened. The silence stretched. Then something unexpected happened. A forgotten photograph slipped from between the pages of an old notebook resting on a nearby shelf. It landed gently on the floor as though moved by nothing more than chance. They picked it up with trembling hands. The image itself was ordinary, but what they noticed was not the picture. It was the date written on the back. It matched today. Not the year. The day. The exact same day that you unknowingly made the decision that shifted your own heart. A chill ran through them. Coincidence tried to explain it away. Their heart refused to listen. For the first time in a very long while, they smiled through tears instead of despite them. But the greatest surprise had not even arrived yet. Because while they believed today's strange signs were finished, someone connected to both of your stories in a way neither of you has discovered had just uncovered a truth that could explain why this overwhelming happiness appeared at the exact moment you changed. And what that person is about to reveal will leave your soulmate speechless. My beloved child. The truth did not arrive like thunder. It entered the story quietly, almost politely, through the hands of someone who had no intention of changing anyone's future that morning. They had been sorting through old boxes, clearing shelves that had collected years of forgotten letters, faded photographs, and journals that no one had opened in a long time. Most of it seemed ordinary pieces of a life carefully packed away. But hidden between two worn notebooks was a sealed envelope with a single sentence written across the front. Open only when your heart finally believes again. Those words were enough to stop everything. The envelope was not addressed to your soulmate, yet every instinct told this person it somehow belonged in their hands. They hesitated. Their fingers hovered above the paper as though respecting a story that had waited patiently for years to continue. When the seal finally broke, the letter inside contained no dramatic prophecy, no impossible promise. Instead, it described something astonishingly simple. It spoke about how the strongest connections often survive seasons of silence, not because people stop caring, but because both hearts are quietly becoming the people they were always meant to be before meeting again. The person reading those words felt an unexpected shiver. They immediately thought of your soulmate. Not because they knew every detail, but because they had watched them change over the past months. They had seen the forced smiles become genuine. They had noticed how grief slowly gave way to compassion. Most of all, they remembered hearing your soulmate say only days earlier, "I don't know why, but something tells me I shouldn't give up yet." At nearly the same moment, your soulmate stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky had become a masterpiece of deep blue fading into soft gold as the last light disappeared beyond the horizon. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh earth after rain, and for reasons they couldn't explain, every breath felt lighter than the one before it. The heaviness they had carried for so long was beginning to dissolve, replaced by a quiet confidence that had no logical source. Then came an emotional twist neither of you expected. They received a phone call from someone they hadn't heard from in months. The conversation began with ordinary questions, but quickly turned into something far more personal. "I need to tell you something," the voice said. "I almost didn't call because I wasn't sure it mattered anymore. But today I realized I was wrong. Your soulmate stood completely still. I met someone this afternoon who mentioned a story that reminded me of you. They described a person who finally stopped running from their own heart. Someone who chose peace instead of fear. And the strange thing is, the moment they told me that story, I thought of only one person." Your soulmate's heartbeat quickened. No names were spoken. No explanations were offered. Yet deep inside, a quiet certainty began to grow. Could it really be you? Could the invisible change they had been feeling somehow begin with a decision you made without ever knowing its impact? When the call ended, they didn't rush back inside. Instead, they looked up at the stars just beginning to appear. Every unanswered question suddenly felt less frightening. For the first time in a long while, uncertainty no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like an unopened door. Meanwhile, your own journey continued without dramatic signs or miraculous interruptions. You simply found yourself noticing small things differently. Music sounded richer. Conversations felt more meaningful. The burdens that had once demanded all your attention seemed strangely quieter. You couldn't explain why your heart felt more spacious, only that something inside had finally made room for hope again. Neither of you realized that this inner transformation was creating an invisible bridge. Not a bridge built by fate forcing two lives together. A bridge built by two separate choices to become emotionally whole. And bridges like that cannot be rushed. They must be crossed one honest step at a time. Later that night, the person who had discovered the hidden letter looked closer at the final page. At first they thought it was blank. But when the paper caught the light from a nearby lamp, faint handwriting slowly appeared, words written so lightly they were almost invisible. There was only one sentence. When both hearts stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begin asking, "Who am I becoming because of this?" the waiting is almost over. The reader's eyes filled with emotion. They folded the letter carefully. Then, without hesitation, they reached for their phone. They weren't calling your soulmate. They were calling someone else. Someone who had quietly influenced both of your lives years ago without either of you ever realizing it. And what that person is about to reveal could completely change everything either of you believed about how this story truly began. My beloved child. The phone rang only twice before it was answered. On the other end was a voice softened by time, carrying the quiet wisdom of someone who had witnessed more beginnings and endings than they could count. Before the caller could explain why they had reached out so unexpectedly, the older voice spoke first. "I've been wondering when someone would finally ask about that." The words landed with startling calm, as though this conversation had been patiently waiting for its appointed hour. A long silence followed. Not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that settles over a room when everyone senses something important is about to be uncovered. "I never told either of them," the voice continued. "It wasn't my story to tell. They both needed the freedom to grow without carrying expectations they weren't ready to understand." The caller felt their pulse quicken. What do you mean? Another pause. Years ago, before either of them realized how deeply their lives would change, I saw something neither of them could see. Every time their paths came close, one of them was healing while the other was still learning. Whenever one was finally ready to give, the other was still trying to protect old wounds. It wasn't bad timing. It was unfinished growth. Those words settled like gentle rain after a season of heat. For so long, both of you had quietly wondered whether missed opportunities meant something had been lost forever. But what if nothing had been lost at all? What if every delay had quietly been protecting something too precious to rush? While that conversation unfolded, your soulmate found themselves unable to sleep. The house was completely still. Moonlight spilled across the floor, tracing silver patterns against the walls. They wandered into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, staring through the window into the darkness. Then something unexpected happened. Their phone vibrated. Not with a message. Not with a call. A simple photo memory appeared automatically. It wasn't a picture of you. It was a picture of themselves from years earlier. They looked at the younger version of their own face for a long time. There was a smile in that photograph, but behind it they could now recognize something they had missed back then, a quiet loneliness they had spent years pretending didn't exist. Instead of feeling sadness, they whispered something they had never said before. "I'm proud of you for surviving." The word surprised even them. In that instant, tears returned, but these were different from the ones that had come before. They were not celebrating another person. They were honoring the version of themselves that had endured enough pain to finally become capable of receiving genuine love without fear. That realization changed everything. Because they suddenly understood that the greatest miracle was never about finding someone else. It was about becoming someone who no longer needed to hide behind old disappointments. At almost the same time, your own heart experienced a shift you couldn't explain. A conversation from your past drifted into your memory. Not because it hurt. Because it no longer did. The words that once echoed with regret now sounded strangely distant, as though they belonged to someone you used to be rather than someone you still were. You smiled without forcing it. For the first time in longer than you could remember, forgiveness no longer felt like something you were trying to accomplish. It had quietly become part of who you were. Neither of you knew that these separate moments were unfolding within the same hour. Two different homes. Two different nights. One remarkable transformation. Elsewhere, the older voice finally revealed the part of the story that had remained hidden for so long. "I met both of them separately," they said. "Years apart. They each asked me almost the same question." The caller leaned forward. "What question?" The answer came gently. They both wanted to know whether becoming a kinder person would ever truly matter if no one noticed. The room became perfectly still. The caller closed their eyes. Neither of you had known the other had wrestled with the very same doubt. Neither of you had realized that your greatest acts of courage happened in private, unseen by the world. Yet those unseen choices had been quietly shaping the future all along. The older voice took a slow breath before speaking once more. "I never answered their question directly." "Why not?" Because life was already preparing the answer. The caller's hands trembled. And now? A warm smile could almost be heard through the phone. Now they're finally close enough to recognize it. But just as hope began replacing every remaining uncertainty, something completely unforeseen interrupted the unfolding story. Across town, tucked inside a drawer that had not been opened in years, someone else discovered an object connected to both of your lives. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a photograph. It was something neither of you remembered existed. And engraved upon it was a date, one that would make your soulmate realize this journey may have begun long before either of you ever met. The truth behind that forgotten keepsake is about to change everything. My beloved child. The forgotten keepsake rested in an aging wooden drawer beneath a stack of carefully folded papers that had not been touched in years. Dust shimmered in the early morning light as gentle hands lifted it into view. It was small enough to fit in a palm, worn smooth by time, carrying the quiet dignity of something that had once meant everything to someone. There was no dramatic glow. No impossible miracle. Only the unmistakable feeling that this object had been patiently waiting for the right heart to find it. The person who uncovered it turned it over slowly. Engraved on the back was a single date. Not a birthday. Not an anniversary. It marked the day two completely different lives had unknowingly made the same life-changing decision. On opposite sides of the country. Without ever meeting. Without ever speaking. Both had chosen to keep believing in kindness after experiencing disappointment that could easily have made them bitter. The discovery was so unexpected that the finder immediately searched through old journals stored beside the drawer. One page after another revealed ordinary entries about everyday life, until one sentence caused them to stop breathing for a moment. Today I met two strangers months apart, and although they never crossed paths, they carried the same quiet light. The handwriting belonged to someone who had passed through both of your stories years before, someone whose influence neither of you had fully recognized at the time. As those pages were read aloud, another realization emerged. Neither of you had changed because of one extraordinary event. You had been transformed through hundreds of invisible decisions. The apology you never demanded. The dream you refused to abandon. The compassion you offered when no reward followed. The evenings you chose growth instead of resentment. Those unnoticed moments had become the foundation beneath everything that was now unfolding. Meanwhile, your soulmate found themselves taking a different route home than usual. There had been no reason to change direction. It simply felt right. The streets were peaceful, washed clean by the previous night's rain. Children laughed in the distance as they chased one another through a neighborhood park. An elderly couple walked hand in hand without speaking, their quiet companionship saying more than words ever could. Your soulmates slowed their pace. For the first time in years, they weren't rushing toward tomorrow. They were fully present today. As they reached a small bookstore tucked between two familiar buildings, something in the window caught their attention. A handwritten sign read, "Sometimes the chapter you thought was ending was only teaching you how to read the next one." They smiled. Not because the sentence answered every question. Because it reminded them they no longer needed every answer to keep moving forward. Inside the bookstore, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with stories that had survived generations. While browsing without intention, one book slipped unexpectedly from a shelf and landed gently near their feet. It opened naturally to a marked page. Someone had underlined a passage years before. Real love is rarely recognized by how quickly it arrives, but by how deeply it transforms the people preparing to receive it. Your soulmate closed the book slowly. The words settled into their heart with astonishing clarity. For months they had been asking when. Now they found themselves asking who they were becoming. That single shift changed the atmosphere inside them more than any certainty ever could. At that same hour, you experienced a moment that appeared almost insignificant. Someone thanked you. Not for a grand achievement. Not for solving a life-changing problem. They simply thanked you for listening. They admitted that one conversation with you had helped them through a difficult season they had never spoken about before. You were stunned. You barely remembered that conversation. To you, it had been an ordinary act of kindness. To them, it had been the beginning of hope. As you walked away, you realized something quietly beautiful. The greatest impact your life had ever made wasn't found in the moments you planned. It lived inside moments you almost forgot. Elsewhere, the person studying the old journals reached the final page. Unlike the others, this page had never been completed. Halfway through a sentence, the writing stopped abruptly. It read, "If the day ever comes when both of them finally understand that love grows strongest after they stop trying to control the outcome." Nothing followed. The unfinished thought lingered like an open doorway. Then something unexpected slipped from between those final pages. It wasn't written by the journal's owner. It was a folded note in unfamiliar handwriting. Across the front were 7 simple words. Please give this to them when they're ready. No names. No address. No explanation. Only a date written beneath the message. Tomorrow. And whoever wrote that note has been quietly waiting all these years for the moment that is about to arrive. My beloved child. Morning arrived with a quiet confidence, as though the world itself understood that certain days carry a different rhythm. Nothing about the sunrise appeared unusual. Birds greeted the light as they always had. Streets slowly awakened. Windows opened. Coffee brewed. Yet beneath those ordinary moments, countless unseen threads were gently drawing closer together, each one connected by choices that had taken years to make. The folded note remained untouched for only a few more hours. The person who had discovered it held it carefully, almost reverently, before unfolding the delicate paper. Time had softened its edges, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. Inside was no prediction, no grand declaration, no impossible promise. Instead, it contained a message that felt deeply human. If you are reading this, it means neither of you became the people fear tried to make you. You chose compassion after disappointment. You chose patience when rushing would have been easier. If those choices have brought you here, then trust this: the greatest gift you will ever offer each other is not perfection. It is the peace you learned while growing apart. The reader closed their eyes. Every mystery suddenly began fitting together not as pieces of a puzzle designed to impress, but as moments in two lives that had quietly been shaping one another without either person realizing it. There was no magic hidden inside the letter. Only wisdom that had waited for hearts mature enough to understand it. Your soulmate, completely unaware that the note had been opened, decided to revisit a place they had not seen in years. It was a simple overlook above a peaceful lake where they had once gone whenever life became too loud. The wooden bench remained exactly where they remembered it. Trees swayed gently overhead, their leaves catching sunlight that danced across the water below. They sat in silence. Not searching. Not worrying. Simply breathing. For the first time, they realized they no longer feared whatever came next. If tomorrow brought reunion, they would welcome it with gratitude. If tomorrow required more waiting, they would meet it with the same steady heart they had worked so hard to build. That realization felt strangely freeing. Because hope no longer depended on certainty. It had become part of who they were. At nearly the same hour, your own path crossed with someone who barely knew you. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. Before leaving, the stranger smiled warmly and said, "You seem different." You laughed softly. Different how? They paused, searching for the right words. Like someone who finally stopped carrying something heavy. The comment lingered long after they disappeared from view. You hadn't announced your healing. You hadn't explained your journey. Yet somehow, the quiet transformation inside you had become visible to others. That was the first time you understood that peace has its own language. It speaks without raising its voice. Later that afternoon, the person who had found the note arranged every journal, every photograph, every keepsake across a large wooden table. Looking at them together revealed something extraordinary. Each memory pointed toward the same lesson. Every setback had quietly redirected both of your lives away from versions of yourselves that would have loved from fear instead of freedom. Every delay had made room for deeper understanding. Every unanswered question had prepared you to recognize what truly mattered when the time finally came. Nothing had been wasted. Not one tear. Not one lonely evening. Not one difficult goodbye. Each moment had become part of the road that led here. Then the final discovery appeared. Tucked inside the back cover of the oldest journal was a tiny pressed wildflower, perfectly preserved despite the passing years. Beneath it was one last handwritten sentence. The happiest tears are never caused by finally finding someone. They are born the moment two people realize they never lost themselves while learning how to love. Those words traveled from the page straight into the reader's heart. At that very moment, your soulmate stood from the bench beside the lake and looked toward the horizon. A gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms through the air. Without planning to, they whispered your name. Not with desperation. Not with sorrow. With gratitude. Miles away, you paused for reasons you couldn't explain. A calm warmth settled over you, subtle but unmistakable, as though your heart had quietly recognized that somewhere, someone was wishing you well without asking for anything in return. Neither of you knew how close your stories had come to touching. Neither of you realized that the greatest revelation was no longer hidden inside old journals or forgotten keepsakes. It was already alive inside both of you. And just as evening began to paint the sky in shades of gold and violet, a message arrived that neither of you expected, a message carrying only a few simple words, yet powerful enough to bring every hidden thread together. What those words say will reveal why your soulmate's tears were never about the past at all, but about the beautiful future that is finally ready to begin. My beloved child. The message did not arrive wrapped in mystery. It arrived with remarkable simplicity. There were no dramatic headlines. No impossible signs. No words designed to overwhelm the heart. Only a single sentence. I finally understand. For anyone else, those 3 words might have seemed ordinary. But for the one who received them, they carried the weight of years. They answered questions that had never found language. They gently closed doors that no longer needed to remain open while quietly unlocking a future that had once felt impossibly distant. The person who had safeguarded the journal smiled as they folded the final page. Every forgotten keepsake, every unfinished letter, every quiet conversation had pointed toward this moment, not because destiny forced 2 people together, but because 2 hearts had finally become ready to meet life with honesty instead of fear. The greatest miracle had never been hidden in the objects. It had been unfolding inside both of you all along. Your soulmate stood beside the lake as the last light of day shimmered across the water. The wind carried away the final traces of uncertainty they had held for so long. They closed their eyes and remembered every season they once wished had ended sooner. The lonely nights. The unanswered prayers. The unexpected detours. The moments when hope felt fragile. For the first time, they looked back on each chapter without resentment. Because they could finally see what those seasons had quietly accomplished. Pain had softened into compassion. Waiting had become wisdom. Disappointment had become patience. And longing had become gratitude. The tears that filled their eyes once more were no longer asking for life to be different. They were thanking life for shaping them into someone capable of loving without losing themselves. At that very same hour, you found yourself watching the evening sky without searching for explanations. The colors above seemed richer than usual. The air felt lighter. Even the silence carried comfort instead of emptiness. You realized that your happiness no longer depended on every question being answered today. Peace had quietly replaced urgency. Confidence had gently taken the place of fear. Without realizing it, you smiled. It was not the smile of someone who had finally reached the end of a journey. It was the smile of someone who had learned to trust the road beneath their feet. Across the distance that still separated your lives, something beautiful was happening. Neither of you was trying to become who the other expected. Neither of you was chasing an impossible version of love. Instead, both of you had discovered the same timeless truth from opposite directions. Real love does not begin when 2 people finally meet. It begins the moment each person chooses to become the kind of soul who can offer kindness without keeping score, forgiveness without forgetting their worth, and hope without demanding immediate answers. That was this your soulmate had been crying about. It was never one dramatic action. It was the quiet decision you made to keep your heart open after life gave you reasons to close it. You finally released what had been weighing you down. You finally chose growth over bitterness. You finally believed that your future deserved more space than your past. And although you could not see it, that single choice echoed farther than you ever imagined. Not because it changed fate overnight. Because it changed you. The older voice, whose wisdom had quietly guided so many moments in this story, looked out through a nearby window as stars slowly appeared overhead. With a peaceful smile they whispered. The journey was never about helping two people find each other. It was about helping two people find themselves. Only then could every chapter make sense. The journals had fulfilled their purpose. The keepsakes could finally rest. The unanswered questions no longer felt unfinished. Every thread that had seemed scattered now formed one beautiful tapestry woven from courage, healing, patience, and quiet faith. And somewhere, perhaps much closer than either of you realized, your soulmate looked toward tomorrow with joyful anticipation instead of anxious expectation. Not because they knew exactly what would happen next, but because they finally understood that whatever tomorrow held, both of you would meet it as stronger, wiser, and more compassionate people than you had ever been before. That realization was enough. It always had been. So if this story found your heart today, let it leave you with one gentle reminder. Never underestimate the quiet victories no one applauds. The choice to forgive. The courage to begin again. The strength to remain kind. The willingness to believe that better days can still arrive. Those moments may seem invisible while you are living them. Yet they have a remarkable way of shaping futures you cannot yet see. May your heart be filled with peace that remains steady through every season. May hope greet you each morning with quiet confidence. May healing continue to replace every burden that no longer belongs to you. And may love, whether already present in your life or still waiting beyond the horizon, find you when your heart is ready to receive it with wisdom, gratitude, and joy. Thank you for sharing this fictional inspirational journey with me. If it touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who could use a little hope today. Until our next story, may peace walk beside you, and may every new sunrise remind you that beautiful chapters are still being written.